Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another stream. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. As you can see, I'm sounding much better today. It's great to be with all of you. And as you can see, I am back with Brian Berletic after a brief hiatus as I was traversing Vietnam. Brian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Welcome back, Danny. And hopefully after this live stream, I can have you on the new Atlas and you can tell us about your travels, because I think you did a lot of really interesting things.
Sure. Yes, definitely. And I would love to have that conversation. And I'm glad to have you on today to have what I feel like is a much needed conversation. Before we get started, everyone, be sure to hit that like button because that helps boost live streams like this one in the YouTube algorithm. I want to say hello to everyone on Rumble. You can follow me on Rumble. Just search my name. Hello, everyone on Rockfin. Hello to all of the moderators in the chat. And of course, you can support Brian by going to his channel. I have it tagged in the title of this video. You can support me by going into the links in the video description. There are many of them from Patreon, Substack, and more where you can support this work. But now we can get started finally after a brief introduction. All right, Brian. So I go to Vietnam, and it's there was the Hamas and the other resistance groups, but led by Hamas. They conduct a breakout, a raid. And then immediately afterwards, Israel is conducting an incredibly destructive bombing campaign that is now ongoing. We are 1 month into this thing. The Ministry of Health in Gaza estimates up to 10,000. There are human rights groups that are affirming that this information is likely accurate. Over 4,000 children. The videos, I'm sure you've seen them all across social media, just absolutely horrendous stuff. We're talking about casualty numbers that dwarf what's gone on in Ukraine in terms of children by almost tenfold at this point. Brian, what is your reaction to all this? Given that you have been following Israel for a long time now, ever since you've become an analyst and started your work, what would you like to say about what's going on with regards to Israel's just destructive, dare I say, genocidal assault on Gaza?
Well, first of all, people may know my work primarily because my coverage of the conflict in Ukraine. But before that, from 2011 onward, I had been focusing almost entirely on the U.S. proxy war in Syria. And before that, the Arab Spring. I was into geopolitical analysis to begin with, to raise awareness of what was happening here in Southeast Asia regarding U.S. interference, proxy conflicts. But the Arab Spring came along. It was a textbook case of what I was witnessing them do here in Southeast Asia. The National Endowment for Democracy building up these opposition groups quietly over the course of several years, bringing in armed militants, using the protests that they were organizing, funding, equipping as cover for the militants to come in and begin the violence, and the possibility of how that can escalate and run out of control. And then that is exactly what we saw from North Africa, across the Middle East, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Libya, many other countries had uprisings, I think, but those are the most significant, the largest amount of destabilization and violence. And we saw that violence escalate into U.S. military interventions in Libya, the U.S. and the rest of NATO bombing Libya, arming these militants on the ground, these so-called freedom fighters who all turned out to be Al-Qaeda after all. And knowingly, we knew that they were Al-Qaeda. And then all of this literally moved from Libya to Syria. They were shipping the militants from Libya over to Syria, to Turkey to enter into Syria from the north. And why am I going over all of this? Because we need to understand the trajectory of everything that has been happening in the region to understand what is happening now. It's not an isolated incident. It is not specific just to Israel and Palestine. We have to understand how this has been unfolding over the last decade or so, or longer, actually, now. So who are the groups involved in the Arab Spring? Yes, there were National Endowment for Democracy funded so-called activists, these opposition groups. There were political parties. Some of them were very pro-West. They were non-secular. But then you had the extremists. The Muslim Brotherhood was at the core of all of the violence. The Muslim Brotherhood was the precursor to Al-Qaeda. And since then, it is adjacent to Al-Qaeda. It is a political organization, but they also have militant factions. And the British Empire, and then afterwards the US, which took up the torch of British imperialism, they've used the Muslim Brotherhood for decades and decades to advance their foreign policy objectives in the region. A lot of people are confused about this, but the clearest way to illustrate how this all works, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, people accuse him of being a US and Israeli puppet. To a certain extent, yes, Egypt was going along with the US. Remember, at that time, the US was still the most powerful country on earth. It had been for a long time. It came out on top in the Cold War. So smaller nations really had no choice but to at least try to conduct a balancing act between the US and the rest of the world. So people identified Hosni Mubarak as a US proxy, as an Israeli proxy. And when they saw the uprisings in 2011, they all cheered on the Arab Spring. They didn't look at who was funding these groups. They didn't look at how, you didn't think 2 or 3 steps ahead what happens when Hosni Mubarak is out. When Hosni Mubarak was removed from power, a Muslim Brotherhood candidate, Mohammed Morsi, came into power. And one of the first things he did in terms of foreign policy was cut ties with Syria and back the US armed, funded, equipped militants trying to overthrow the government in Syria. That is what he did. And then when Morsi was ousted from power in a military coup, the military-led government restored ties to Syria, and they cut all of this support to the US-backed militants. So that's very important to understand. I've talked about Seymour Hersh's article from all the way back in 2007, The Redirection in the New Yorker. And he lays out a very long explanation of how even back then in 2007, the US was building up militants across the region to wage a proxy war against Iran. The Arab Spring was to reorganize the region into a united front against Iran. And we remember General Wesley Clark talking about, I think it was 7 nations in a very short span of time. They were going to overthrow and reorder all of these countries, and Iran was on the list. And so was Libya. I think so was Syria. And so we saw the U.S. literally implementing this policy that General Wesley Clark warned people about. So where does Israel and Palestine fit into all of this? And let's zoom out entirely from the Middle East and look at the entire globe. The US is waging proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, and we'll be talking about that also today. They're in the Middle East. They want to remove the government in Iran. They want to uproot its network of allies across the region, which includes Syria, which includes Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And they're using Israel as the proxy to do that. Yes, they have other allies in the region that they had been using. Saudi Arabia had played a role in this. NATO member Turkey played a role in this. Qatar, many other nations in the region played a role in this. And then we look here in Asia Pacific. The U.S. is preparing proxy war or even a direct intervention with China, using Taiwan as a focal point, but they're also trying to drag in other nations as well, including the Philippines. We will also talk about that. So that is the role Israel plays. It is a proxy. It is a forward operating base in the Middle East. If you look at Israeli foreign policy over the last, at least as long as I've been keeping track of it, it runs in contradiction to a normal nation state's own sense of self-preservation. It is creating enemies all around it, is creating enemies within it, it's pursuing an unsustainable foreign policy linked to the unsustainable pursuit of global hegemony that ultimately the US has organized, and that is what Israel is a part of. So it is unsustainable. It's just like Ukraine from 2014 onward, becoming irrationally belligerent toward Russia, isolating itself, and being overly dependent on the US and Europe. That's exactly what Israel is doing. That's what Israel has been doing. If you look at their trade, it is heavily dependent on the United States and Europe. And so how do we solve this? And how has that led to where we are right now? We saw before October 7th the Hamas raids. And let me just explain, because I mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas is it stems from the Muslim Brotherhood. It was a part of the Muslim Brotherhood in their 1988 charter. You know, it's stated very clearly that they are the Muslim Brotherhood representatives in Palestine. So it's very important to keep that in mind. Before October 7th, we saw a number of things happening in the Middle East. The U.S. proxy war against Syria is stalemated, more or less. If you look at it day to day, it looks like it's not changing. If you zoom out over the last 2 or 3 years, you can see actually the U.S. position there is getting weaker. The U.S. position in Iraq is getting weaker. Saudi Arabia and Iran are repairing their relations. And that is something that a lot of people did not believe was possible, or if it was possible, it was something that was going to happen in the distant future, not now. The people in power now, they could not imagine ever repairing their ties with one another. But that has happened, and it has happened because Russia and China are organizing this. They're trying to create alternatives in the region that these nations politically captured by the US or coerced by the US or influenced or allied to the United States, giving them options and alternatives that are more attractive than this persistent process of divide and conquer. That is what the British Empire had done to the Middle East. That is what the United States continues doing in the Middle East. That is what they are doing right now. So before October 7th, we saw a process of the whole region pivoting away from US unipolarism and the divide and conquer. They're repairing their relationships. They're trying to end these conflicts. And then what happens? October 7th happens. It's almost like pushing a button. The whole region is now at the precipice of war. And the U.S. is building up its military forces. Both Israel and U.S. are conducting strikes, not just against Gaza, but also southern Lebanon, also Syria, and they're openly threatening Iran. So they're trying to take all of this progress, all of this stability, and they're trying to turn it upside down using conflict. And I want to compare this to what happened in Europe before the special military operation began in February 2022. What was happening? Germany was building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Russia. All of Europe was working closely with Russia, especially on energy. Europe was talking about the Belt and Road Initiative. There were even rail links connecting China and Europe and everyone in between, including Vietnam. Vietnam was part of that. They had a line that extended to Vietnam to allow them to ship straight to Europe. The US saw their position in Europe, their primacy over Europe waning. They understood that if this continues, all of these nations are going to end up working with Russia and China, and our ability to dictate foreign policy to Europe, that will be over. They will have an independent foreign policy. Their economy will be independent of our coercion, and that will be it. So how can we stop this conflict? So they baited Russia into a proxy war. They basically gave Russia no alternative but to intervene in Ukraine. They were militarizing it. They were creating a real security risk right on Russia's border. Russia had to react. They intervened, and the U.S. used that as an opportunity to take all of these nations that were getting closer and closer with Russia and China and cut ties entirely. They literally blew up the Nord Stream pipelines, physically destroyed them to cut every tie, political and tangible, with Russia. And you can see how they're using that also as an extension to cut ties between Europe and China. And so when you look at how they did Europe, that's what they're doing in the Middle East right now. That's what they're trying to do here in Southeast Asia. They're using these maritime disputes in the South China Sea, trying to transform it into a much bigger conflict than it ever would on its own. And they're trying to use that chaos to force nations to cut ties or roll back ties with China. So that is what we're looking at in Israel. This assault on Gaza, the October 7th raids, people are saying they took Israel by surprise. I do not believe that. I don't believe that they took Israel by surprise. Just the timing of it, very suspicious. The U.S. proxy war in Ukraine was over. They've lost it. The offensive completely failed. And now there's just going to be this process of what do we do, because we have no options to continue this. And there's no chance of us winning. What do we do? Suddenly October 7th happens. It's very suspicious. Was it planned? To what degree? Who knew? Who was working with Hamas to prepare this? These are things that we can't know without evidence, but it is highly suspicious. I don't think anybody can deny the timing is highly suspicious. And what did Hamas do? And people have to remember, let me qualify this before I get into the October 7th raid. The Palestinian people under international law have the right to take up arms. They have the right to resist illegal occupation by Israel. There are UN resolutions that recognize Israel as an illegal occupier. So under international law, they have every right to take up arms and resist. But is that what Hamas is doing? How did Hamas come into power in the first place? Israel admittedly maneuvered them into power. They maneuvered them into power because they are extremists. They rejected a two-state solution. That is, Israel and Palestine coexisting side by side. They rejected that, just like the Netanyahu administration rejects a two-state solution. And they resort to extremism, which always gives Israel this pretext that they can use to brutalize and incrementally erase the Palestinians. So the October 7th raids take place. They attack military targets, completely legitimate. But then they're also on camera, killing civilians, unarmed civilians, shooting at cars randomly going down the road. Of course, Israel, the Western media, they're going to fabricate claims, exaggerate claims. They say 1,400 Israelis died. They're going to try to portray that as all civilians, when of course there were certainly military personnel involved. But at the end of the day, Hamas was using tactics that ran contra to I think a more viable resistance. And I always compare Hamas to Hezbollah. And people say, Brian, that's not fair, because Hezbollah is not suffering under occupation. They had been from the 1980s all the way to 2000. Southern Lebanon was occupied. That is why Hezbollah exists. They successfully resisted Israeli occupation. They expelled Israel from southern Lebanon. And ever since, they've created a durable deterrence to Israeli incursion into southern Lebanon, demonstrated on 2006, the attempted Israeli incursion to southern Lebanon. A complete failure. Hezbollah stopped them. They don't go out of their way to target civilians. They don't flow over the border and just shoot everybody in sight. They're very careful how they run their resistance. And Hezbollah and their allies in Iran and Syria, they're trying to influence Hamas to pivot into a resistance organization like this, so that they could be part of the solution rather than a constant provocation for more problems. That all aside, Hamas is not recognized as a terrorist organization internationally. It's not recognized as a terrorist organization by, say, Russia or China, but it does use terrorist tactics. And you can see how careful Russia and China, for example, are when dealing with Hamas. If Hamas did not use these tactics, it would be able to attract much wider support, both in the region and internationally. But that is exactly why Israel maneuvered them into power in the first place, to create this type of situation that complicates support for the Palestinian cause. Now, the Israeli reaction to all of this is basically they're using Hamas as a pretext to erase Gaza, and they're starting with northern Gaza. They've cut northern Gaza off from the rest of the strip. Wadi Gaza, they did an incursion straight to the coast. So now it is cut off. It's surrounded by Israeli forces. And now we have to wait and see whether they're going to wait and strangle the militants trapped inside, but also the civilians, or are they going to rush this as they have in previous operations and really play a very tight game in terms of sustaining these military operations versus achieving their objectives. I know I'm running on, so maybe I can give you a chance to jump in, Danny.
No, I mean, surely you're covering all the bases. I think the Hamas situation, from my understanding, it's a complicated one, because on the one hand, you are correct. They are ascendant from the Muslim Brotherhood, And indeed, Israel and the United States, we all remember in 2006, I believe it was, when the United States under the Bush administration and Israel supported, or quote unquote supported, elections in Gaza. Hamas won. But immediately after that, as you said, in terms of pretext, Hamas was then used as a pretext for what has been some of the most brutal sanctions, called the blockade on Gaza, from then all the way until now. So there's definitely that. From my understanding, I believe Hamas has moderated a bit in recent years. I've seen that some factions of Hamas do support the 1967 borders. I know that I know that you bring up a lot, and I think it is true. There were Hamas fighters in Syria fighting on behalf of the so-called umbrella of sort of jihadist organizations looking to overthrow the government on behalf of all these border states, Israel, etc. I mean, we know that Hamas does get a lot of funds and arms from Qatar, for example, which was big in the regime change operation in Syria. And on the other hand, there has been a normalization process, so to speak, because Syria sees Hamas as really the only game in town in Palestine proper now, because the Palestinian Authority has been kind of a non-entity for quite a while in terms of its ability to advocate for anything Palestinian justice-wise. So it's quite complicated, but I think what's so interesting now from all that you say, and we'll definitely get to the global ramifications in a bit, but just how magnificent and extravagant, if not just brutal, this assault has been against Gaza in this moment. And one thing that I've been thinking about, you brought up the Ukraine situation. Ukraine, that proxy war, took the political language of NATO and the United States and the entire alliance of warmongers. It took the language and the posture to a whole other level, where diplomacy itself was seen as radical, was seen as like impossible, was seen as just anathema. Now we're seeing with the situation between Israel and Gaza and Israel's assault, the very idea of a ceasefire now is anathema to anything even the United States can. The United States won't even say the word ceasefire. They say the word humanitarian pause now, and they're advocating for humanitarian pause. But of course, not even Israel is going to support even just a few days where they're not dropping bombs. So my question to you, Brian, is why is it that whether it's Israel, whether we talk about Ukraine, but maybe we can focus just on the situation with Israel and the United States, why is it that they're so hell-bent on destruction at this moment? And of course, it is happening in Gaza most acutely, but as you said, this is definitely a regional, a regional problem, a regional policy and project.
Because it puts everyone in the region into a quandary. Now, look at Hezbollah. Hassan Nasrallah, he made this statement very predictably. He was very restrained. He was not committing Hezbollah to intervene in any shape, form, or way. This has always been their policy. They have never mobilized in support of Hamas, except the only time they've mobilized regarding Hamas was to fight them in Syria, as you pointed out, Danny. So they're sitting there. They want to support the Palestinian cause. You also mentioned that Hamas is the only game in town. This is why Iran is working with Hamas. They have to try to pivot them away from this role as a useful proxy and provocation and move them into a more constructive position for this whole process. And the same goes for Russia, and the same goes for China and everyone else in the region. They understand that, especially from the Palestinian people's point of view, these people are desperate. They're dying. They're watching their families be eradicated. The conditions that they live in on a day-to-day basis, even when they're not trying to struggle to survive, is extreme. As everything about it is extreme, and it elicits extreme emotions. They understand that when they see Hamas fighting Israel, they don't care about the background, Hamas's origins. They don't care about the details of how Israel was involved in maneuvering them into power. They just see Hamas fighting, and they support it because they are suffering. It's really that simple, and people understand that. Nasrallah understood that. He's going to praise Hamas, even though Hezbollah would never carry out an operation like that, because he understands the people, the Palestinian people. You can't explain it to them when they're in this state of mind. So what does this do to the rest of the region? Look at all of the normalization that was taking place regarding Israel. That is all suspended or being reversed. It seems counterintuitive to say that normalization with Israel was ultimately going to lead to a two-state solution. We were just talking about the Abraham Accords before we went live, and people worry that if you normalize relations with Israel, you're normalizing all of the horrible things that they're doing to the Palestinian people. You're normalizing occupation. But we have to stop and think about that for a moment, and just look at the other process of normalization taking place in the region between Syria and the Arab world, and also between Syria and Turkey. Turkey still occupies Syrian territory, and yet Syria and Turkey are working to fix their relations. You have to normalize relations first, then you can resolve all of these issues, these disputes, territorial disputes, all of these other problems that you have. You can resolve that second. And that was the mindset of people attempting to normalize relations with Israel. Now, of course, the US was involved. Their goal was to draw in the Arab world, normalize relations with Israel, and then Israel was just going to annex Palestinian territory anyway. Just like the Minsk agreements, just like the One China policy, just like the Iran nuclear deal, the US fully prepared to betray this agreement that they were working on between Israel and the Arab world. But an agreement on a piece of paper was never going to result in the two-state solution anyway. It was changing the facts on the ground in the region. That is what's eventually going to lead to a two-state solution. That is what Russia and China are working on. That is what Iran and Syria are working on. This is what they have managed to begin convincing people in Ankara and in Riyadh of. And this was the process that was taking place before October 7th. And you see, even now, as Israel is literally flattening and bulldozing northern Gaza, you still see restraint across the entire region. They realize that it is a trap, and that if they fall into this trap, all of the death and destruction that we see in Gaza is just going to spread across the rest of the region. And I've heard people say that the U.S. military doesn't have enough forces in the region to actually fight a war with Iran and win. But then again, they didn't have enough forces and military industrial production to fight and win a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, but they did it anyway. And we've often talked about this, Danny, how they're running against the clock. The U.S. hegemony is racing against time. All across the globe, they're running out of time. And they're making bad decisions because they have no good options to reassert themselves. The only option that they actually have, the only viable option, is to understand that global hegemony is irrational, it's unachievable. This path that they're on to try to reassert it is unsustainable, and that they need to find a rational place among a multipolar world. But they're not ever going to do that. So they're just going to make worse and worse decisions as they try to reverse these three fronts that we see them working on in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, and in Asia. So the October 7th raids, I mean, really, it was the perfect pretext to first distract everyone from the failing proxy war in Ukraine and to stop the process of normalization in the Middle East. Essentially stop the process that Russia and China were working on to reorder the region outside of the unipolar order the US had imposed on it for decades and decades.
And if you look at maybe we can zone in on Israel just for a second, and then I definitely want to get into RFK Jr.'s comment, because I think it zones back out into the global significance of all of this. But in terms of Israel, it feels like Israel is really trying to capitalize, in particular, Netanyahu's leadership. But I think sometimes people make a little bit too big of a deal about Netanyahu's particular position. I mean, this guy, you've been following Israel for a while. This guy's a mainstay. He could do a lot, and he'll still be in politics regardless. So all this, like, oh, Netanyahu's in trouble, all this, I am not so confident in Israeli internal politics to believe anything of the sort. But I think the big point is that there is a crisis for Israel in the sense that, it won't be able to continue forever to, go against international law and continue to do what it's doing in stagnation. And the fact is that the United States is pretty weak on all fronts, and it feels like the United States has pivoted back to the Middle East in large part because of its failures with regard to Ukraine, because I think it's probably a miscalculation here, and honestly, the timing is probably horrendous for Biden, but at the same time, there is no real avenue for any kind of foreign policy achievement when it comes to Asia or Ukraine. So the Middle East feels like this place where they want to put their energy into. But from what I'm seeing is that Israel, in effect, and this might be independent of the United States in some respect, although according to the Ayatollah in Iran, the U.S. is running this war too. But I do believe there's some independence here on the part of Israel, trying to take advantage of the U.S.'s weakness by going full scale ahead and doing what it's wanted to do for quite a while, which is to complete its process of expansion in Palestine. Because, as you know, Brian, Israel is not just interested in dominating the area, the nation of Palestine, but also going way beyond that. That's why it occupies the Golan Heights. That's why it has so many disputes with countries like Lebanon, even Egypt. It's because Jordan, it's because it has ambitions to continue expanding. And that's a huge deal for the United States. And I want to get your comment as I pull up RFK Jr. right now.
Sure, and you're absolutely right. Time is running out for Israel, just like it's running out for all U.S. proxies that are part of what the U.S. is attempting to do. People have to remember that Israel is not a monolithic state. There are many different political parties. There are people in Israel who believe in a two-state solution, and there's people in Palestine who believe in a two-state solution. There's people who support the Palestinian cause who believe in a two-state solution. So really, the goal here is to move these extremists out of the way so that rational people can sit down and agree to a two-state solution, which would benefit the best interests of everyone involved, the real best interests of everyone involved. Just like, say, in Ukraine, does it benefit the actual people of Ukraine and Ukraine as a viable nation state to continue fighting against Russia? Did it make any sense to begin this war in the first place? And the answer is obviously no. That is why the U.S. maneuvers and maintains irrational administrations in power in these proxy states, and Israel's no exception. So Netanyahu's administration is there precisely because it rejects a two-state solution and it refuses to sit down and make peace with anyone. It's like the Israeli Zelensky. Zelensky has changed the law, so it's impossible for him to negotiate with Russia. That is the ideal state the U.S. wants their proxies in. When you want to divide and conquer, having client regimes fully committed to perpetual chaos, that it's the ideal situation. But you're right, Israel cannot keep doing this forever. They have these ambitions beyond the borders that they have right now. It will never happen. It was already becoming increasingly unsustainable before all of this has happened. The whole move from unipolarism to multipolarism. What is actually driving that? It's not just people sitting down and agreeing to do this. It's because all of these nations are developing their industry. They're developing technology independent of the monopolies that the West had held for so many decades. So it is change on the ground economically, militarily, in terms of infrastructure, that is driving all of these political developments. And it's going to continue no matter what the US and the current administration in Israel does. They know it's inevitable. So that it almost seems like they're rushing, just like we always warned that they're going to rush regarding Taiwan. It's like they're rushing to eliminate the Palestinian people because they know a two-state solution is inevitable.
Yeah, and I truly do believe that Israel thinks, well, if we can get rid of all Palestinian people, the definition of a genocide, then it's a victory. Then they win. They're permanent. There's no possibility. In history, other empires and other colonial powers have tried to do this, where they say, oh, if we can get rid of all the Africans in certain colonies, the French try to do this, the British try to do this, the English try to do this. If we can get rid of the Spanish, get rid of all of them, then we win. We can't be challenged anymore. But the world is a much different place. But here's RFK Jr., his latest comments on Israel. Of course, RFK Jr. has come under much fire for being a very Zionist in his political, positions regarding his election. He's received a lot of criticism of late, especially for those who are opposed to wars in the Middle East, opposed to the brutality against the Palestinian people. But here is RFK Jr. saying the quiet part out loud, but kind of unintentionally. He's just telling it how he sees it. He's giving Israel kind of a tongue bath here, saying Israel is so important. But I think he reveals kind of some fundamental facts that I definitely want you to comment on, Brian. So here we go.
And Israel is critical. And the reason it's critical is because it's a bulwark for us in the Mideast. It's almost like having an aircraft carrier in the Mideast. It's our oldest ally. It's been our ally for 75 years. It has been an incredible ally for us in terms of the technology, the exchange. And, and building the Iron Dome, which we paid a lot for, has also taught us enormously about how to defend ourselves at home for missiles. So those military expenditures are all going. 75% of it goes to U.S. companies under the agreement, under the MOU. But if you look at what's happening in the Mideast now, Iran is now the closest allies to Iran are Russia and China. Iran also controls all of Venezuela's oil.
Uh-oh. Where'd Danny go? People in the comment section, did Danny disappear, or did I go offline? Comment section, please. There's Danny. I can't hear you, Danny. Okay, now I hear you.
Sorry about that. Hold on one second. I just need to go back. I kicked myself out of my own stream. All right, let me pull this back up because it was playing. Hold on one second. So let's pull this back up and let's rewind, maybe halfway, and let's just start from here. Here we go.
Are all going. 75% of it goes to U.S. companies under the agreement, under the MOU. But if you look at what's happening in the Mideast now, Iran is now the closest allies to Iran are Russia and China. Iran also controls all of Venezuela's oil. Hezbollah is in Venezuela. They have propped up the Maduro regime, and so they control that oil supply. BRICS, Saudi Arabia is now joining BRICS. So those countries will control 90% of the oil in the world. If Israel disappears, the vacuum in the Mideast, which is, Israel is our ambassador, it's our presence, our beachhead in the Mideast, and it gives us ears and eyes in the Mideast. It gives us intelligence. It gives us the capacity to influence affairs in the Mideast. If Israel disappeared, Russia and China would be controlling the Mideast, and they control 90% of the world's oil supply, and that would be cataclysmic for U.S. national security. So that's the answer to you.
So, I mean,
Just
what more
it's
can we
just on
say?
It's just unabashed imperialism. He's basically saying Israel is our colony in the Middle East. If we lose control of Israel, because all of our other so-called allies, captured states, they're pivoting away from us, then we'll just be out of luck. And just think about what he's saying. The United States on the other side of the planet will have no control over a region where it's not even located in on a map. That's what he's saying. And so I always warn people, and you'll never see me do a whole video about U.S. elections because they're meaningless. All of the people involved are. It's just a show to keep people believing that they somehow have some role in determining what's going on. That is not how U.S. foreign and domestic policy is determined. It's not determined in the White House or in Congress. It's determined by these corporate-funded think tanks. The list of the corporations funding them are on their websites. You can go look at it right now. They have these policy papers written up. They're turned into bills. Certain parts of them are turned into bills by lawyers. They go to Washington with lobbyists. The lobbyists get it rubber stamped. Everyone in Washington doesn't even read it most of the time. And then the corporate media sells this policy to the American public to try to convince them that it's for their own good. And that's how it actually works. It doesn't matter who gets voted in as president or who's controlling Congress. We've watched this for as long as I've been paying close attention to this, from Bush Jr. all the way up until now. If you didn't tell me who the president was, I wouldn't even know that there had been a change in administration, because it is exactly the same foreign policy. It continues uninterrupted, continuity of agenda. And then all that we get from, say, the White House or from Congress is rhetoric, spin. It's explained to us in different ways. George Bush would explain to us why we're in all these wars. Obama would swear if you vote for him, he would end them. But then he would have his own excuse and spin as to why he was continuing and expanding all of these wars. So yes, people who are investing all of their hope in RFK or any candidate for that matter, that is, unfortunately, that is just hope, empty hope.
Yeah, and it's quite astounding to hear him talk about Israel playing this very particular function for the United States in this way, in a manner that's not unironic. I mean, he's actually just
as if it's a good
these
thing.
Things
Yes.
yes, exactly, as if this is something that people want to hear. Now, of course, there are some people who want to hear this. I'm not even sure that his Israeli lobbyist donors really want to hear this, because it is a little bit too honest,
Too much,
and maybe
yes.
even outside of their framework of how they think about things. Because honestly, I don't know how much the average Israeli lobbyist is thinking about BRICS Plus, for example. I think they're more so thinking about, how do I get U.S. politicians to do whatever Israel wants to do? How can we get them to do what Israel wants to do and rubber stamp everything that Israel does? That's generally what I think they think about. So it's astounding to hear him say, well, it's about being an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It's about ensuring that Israel plays, literally, he said, beachhead in the region, so that BRICS Plus countries, Iran, Russia, China, they can't they essentially have control over their own resources and develop independently of the United States. Meaning that what this seems to suggest is that the Palestinian people, what many people are calling genocide, ethnic cleansing, all of this very real horror happening. It means the Palestinian people are literally sacrifices for what is a global agenda. It is an imperial agenda. It's not simply Israel just wants to take all the land. It does want the land. It does want what's underneath Gaza. Gaza is very rich, has a lot of gas underneath there. But it is about, well, Palestinian people are kind of just in the way of this plan, and Israel has its own interests, but the United States will allow it. The United States could end it. A lot of people say this, and I always think to myself, okay, yes, theoretically, but in reality, this idea that the United States could stop Israel from doing what it's doing is kind of misguided, because the United States will let Israel do what it does as long as Israel is serving U.S. interests.
Absolutely. And let's just put it this way, because I see a lot of people always arguing somehow Israel, this country with this tiny GDP and relatively small military, somehow they've captured control of America, and all the horrible things that Washington does is against their will. The Jews are making them do it. They otherwise they would want to have peace and let the people in the Middle East have their freedom and their independence. It doesn't work that way. And I just want to point something out, and maybe a little mental exercise here. Just look at how insane everything became in 2022 regarding Ukraine. Just remember how the media was covering it and portraying it, the political system, all of these people falling over themselves to get to Kiev and pose with President Vladimir Zelensky. And they were thinking about changing laws, and the social media platforms were booting people for even questioning Ukraine, and the things that they're doing are just pointing out simple facts. People were going to jail for that, literally going to jail for that. And look at all the money that was being sent to Ukraine, and look at all of the impunity that the U.S. lent and the EU lent Ukraine, and all of the things that they had been doing. Not just from 2022 onward, but from 2014 onward. We talk about Gaza. The client regime in Kiev had the same sort of obsession with the Donbas region, also Crimea to a certain extent. It's not a perfect analogy. They had this obsession with the territory, and just like you say, Danny, that serves U.S. interests because they were trying to bait Russia into a conflict, and that's how they were doing it. They don't care about, the U.S. doesn't care about the Donbas region, who controls it. They couldn't care less. And they don't care about Gaza or the West Bank or any of the other territories the Israelis are occupying. All they care about is their ability to use that as a pretext and as a provocation. That is how they use Israel. That is how they've used Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and that is how they've used Hamas. And I just want to kind of talk about something you mentioned before, Danny. Hamas is also not a monolithic organization, has many different factions, and you're absolutely right. From their 1988 charter to 2017, when they revised it, it was quite a change. And it's signified that at least some people in Hamas were thinking about pivoting, just as I explained, Iran, Syria, Russia, China wanted them to pivot. That is a process that is taking place, but there's still obviously factions that were not on board for it. So we have to keep all of this in mind. It's not really that cut and dry. It's not black and white. We have to keep in mind all of this. We have to zoom out. A lot of people get obsessed with the minutia of everything that's happening between Israel and Palestine. You have to zoom out and see it in the larger context. And when you look at Ukraine and you see how the U.S. its relationship works with Ukraine, and then how its relationship works with Israel, it's very similar. So, I mean, is the U.S. sending all of these weapons and money and granting Ukraine impunity because the Ukraine lobby controls Washington and controls the media? No, it serves U.S. interests, just like you said, Danny.
Yeah, and maybe to close on the Palestine topic, my position has been on this issue because it's both, I feel like I've been following this for many, many, many years before I got into even media, even when I was just, an activist out there finding out about what was going on in Palestine. And, on the one hand, right, I think it's important that people are highlighting the horror that's happening to the Palestinian people. I do think social media does get a little rough when it comes to the all over and over and over again the stories, but I get why people do it, is because they're trying to push the reality that people are suffering, and I mean untold suffering, like just intense amounts of suffering that is unimaginable to most people around the world. Right, we're talking about 160 children killed per day. That's in a very densely populated area. It's a nightmare. It's a massacre. And at the same time, this conflict, like the Palestinian people, they have the right to resist. They will continue to resist. Pretty confident in that. When Palestinians have done peaceful resistance, we saw the March of Return not too long ago. It was just, 4 or 5 years ago. the March to Return, children are being shot at even during peaceful protests. So we know that Palestinians exercise all kinds of ways of protesting. And at the same time, I believe that the only way this conflict is ever going to be resolved is regionally. I don't know how that's going to happen. On the one hand, it's very possible. It's happened before many, many, many times, at least a couple of times it's already happened, where there have been many, Arab countries, countries in the region feeling like they have to go to war with Israel to resolve this problem. Not sure if that's going to happen now, not sure if that's going to happen in the future, but it certainly is a possibility. Also, it could be maybe peaceful in the sense that these countries come together and there's just such an overwhelming force where Israel is isolated to a certain extent. But I think what's very important is that the United States is the one that is making that possibility basically a non-starter, because there is no negotiation. Israel, of course, is not even looking at a ceasefire, but we're talking about the United States pushing war in this way, and there's no other alternative. There's not even the uttering of a ceasefire, because the United States is so committed to war. So I think that regardless of how it happens, when the Palestinian people finally get their self-determination, finally get their justice, it's going to be a regional, if not a global phenomenon, similar to what happened in South Africa, similar to what happened in other parts of the world that have fought similar kinds of conflicts, anti-colonial conflicts. It hardly ever is just the people themselves or just throw off the yoke. It didn't happen. Vietnam got a lot of help. I was just there. Vietnam had a lot of help, a lot of help globally. Russia, Soviet Union at the time, China, Cuba, more help, a lot of help. Without that help, I don't think Vietnam would have been able to win. So it'll probably be similar with regard to Palestine. And it's a different moment now than in those periods. So it's going to be interesting to see where things go forward. But anyway, any closing thoughts on the Palestine before we move on?
Yes. Well, I just want to add, I think that it's going to unfold as it had been before October 7th. The region is going to avoid escalation. Hezbollah's committed to not being pulled into this trap. The U.S. wants conflict. They want to destroy the region like they're destroying Europe. This is how they see themselves maintaining control and influence over the region. And the region is going to do everything in their power to avoid this. And Israel's going out of their way to be as atrocious as possible, because this is an attempt to provoke the region into war. And we see all of the protests breaking out across the Arab and Muslim world. And they are doing this to deliberately put pressure on these governments, to force them into a course of action that they don't want to take. The situation with Israel, they said this for years, and people never believed that it was possible, that eventually Israel would pivot toward multipolarism. They would eventually have to, if they wanted to continue to exist. And we saw them in a process toward that. And again, it's the extremists that are in power right now. Who's empowering them, though? How is Netanyahu's administration in power, and why do they continue to stay in power? The United States. And you see Russia and China fully understand that the U.S. is the source of this problem. It's not in Israel. It is in the United States. They are empowering Israel. And if you can diminish America's presence and influence in the region, you're going to diminish this control and influence they have over Israel and every other country in the region. So that's what they're working on. That's what they will continue to work on. I know it's not what people want to hear, but it's going to be a very long process, a very hard process. We're watching Israel trying to erase northern Gaza basically off the map. And that is very hard to watch. People have to remember, though, you have to look at the big picture. If you escalate this conflict into a wider war, all of that death and destruction is going to spread. It's going to involve millions of people. And the region wants to avoid that. And just look at Russia and their intervention in Syria. Turkey shot down one of their jets. I remember at the time people were saying Putin's a coward. He won't retaliate. He should bomb Ankara. But that patience has paid off. And Russia is in a better position now because of that strategic patience and that ability to look into the future and think several steps ahead. And so the immediate reaction that seems the most obvious is often the worst type of decision to make. It's usually going to put you somewhere you don't want to be rather than put you on the path where you need to go. So this persistent patience, both Russia and China have exhibited for decades, really, when you look at it, and it is paying off. But that ordinary people, that's not the answer. They want to see this, and understandably so. They want to see it stop now. So, what can ordinary people, or people like you and I, Danny, what can we do? We can just continue highlighting the horrors that Israel's inflicting and remind people that this is being enabled entirely by the United States. So all the U.S., if they wanted to stop, all they have to do is stop sending the bombs, because these are U.S. bombs that they're dropping. This U.S. military hardware that they're using, their military-industrial complex, Israel's military-industrial complex, could not sustain any sort of operation like this. And Netanyahu's administration couldn't remain in power without the support it gets from the United States. It's just like Zelensky in Ukraine. Everything that Ukraine has been doing since 2014 has been enabled by the West. It could not have done it any other way.
Yeah, we didn't even get to talk about how Russia and China at the United Nations Security Council standing alone, calling for a genuine ceasefire that legitimizes not just the fact that Palestinian people need things like the right to breathe and to have food and water and things like this, but also recognizes what you brought up earlier, which is the right to a Palestinian state, justice for Palestinians, not just Israel's security interests, which of course Russia and China, given that they are diplomatic masters at this point, they recognize, regardless of whatever personal opinions anyone has, they recognize Israel as a country that has, recognized by the United Nations. So you have to recognize their security interests, so to speak. But at the same time, you can't just drop the Palestinian question. You can't drop the international law, the UN resolutions that exist regarding Palestine, and Russia and China have upheld that. Russia went so far as to say, their UN envoy went so as far to say that Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself in this situation. What it's doing is not self-defense, which is 100% correct. Yes. And the U.S., as you said, Brian, is the problem here, because it's it's the bombs, it's the funding, it's the arming, it's basically
the media
allowing Israel to do them. The media, the political cover, the propaganda war. And then, of course, even at this level, right, it's the United States that is sitting on the UN Security Council, giving a nudge to its European friends and saying, hey, vote with us. We're going to veto any kind of legitimate ceasefire. And then we'll throw in these garbage proposals, which no one is ever going to accept on the other side, like, a couple hours pause while Israel gets the right to defend itself. And, it can just, so this is the reality that we live in. And it's going to take, I think you're exactly right. There's a reason why Iran, Hezbollah, we heard Nasrallah's speech. They are in solidarity with Palestine. Hezbollah is doing something regarding this issue. They are fighting they have to fight on the border, first of all, because Israel has basically opened up a front there. But
yes,
they are also doing it because they understand how important it is to not just defend themselves, but to allow Palestine some breathing room, allow Gaza some breathing room by taking, it was right in Nasrallah's speech. He said, we're doing this in part because we know how important it is. So Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, these countries stand in solidarity with Palestine, but it's a very complicated situation. They can't go in. Syria cannot go into war. Iran certainly cannot just go into a war without running the risk of destroying any kind of stability in the region. And it sounds really hard in terms of making those kind of choices, but the reality is that the problem lies with the United States, because the United States has caused all of these problems. It should not be an issue, right? Yes. Iran shouldn't have to worry about sanctions. Syria should not have to worry about sanctions. They shouldn't have to worry about a nuclear war starting just because they're defending the legitimate rights of the people in that region. But that's the position we're in.
And just another thing to throw in there, I mean, the U.S. attempt to draw Iran and its allies into this, the U.S. presence in the region is direct aimed at Iran. I mean, that is the obstacle that they need to remove out of their way. Iran is going into BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It is successfully circumventing U.S. sanctions. You can see how the global economic system is changing in such a fundamental way that it is going to give Iran even more ability and opportunities to get around those sanctions. And because the U.S. put sanctions on Russia, they're beginning to put sanctions on China. And so everyone decided to just create an alternative system, which now allows a nation like Iran under sanctions for decades to finally get into this alternative system, and then they can get their economy going again. But they've been surviving all along anyway. And so the U.S. can see this window of opportunity closing in the Middle East. If they don't do it now, they may never have a chance to do it. Iran is irreversibly moving away from this shadow that the U.S. has cast over them. And once they're gone, the U.S. cannot get them back. And we talk about this all the time regarding China. Once China surpasses the U.S. will never be able to be in a position to try to encircle and contain China ever again. They understand that. They don't have any good options to stop it from happening, but they feel if they just try something now, it's better than nothing, because later they won't even be able to try this much. They won't even be able to exercise these bad options. And for these people running U.S. foreign policy, they don't see any personal cost. It's not them dying. It's not their money. They aren't going to make money no matter how it goes. Do you think the people funding these think tanks, like the Atlantic Council, these arms manufacturers, do you think they're upset that the Ukraine conflict? I mean, surely they may be a little upset, but they still made billions upon billions of dollars doing so. So we have to keep all that in mind. And Danny, it's a very difficult decision looking at what's happening to Gaza and having to make that decision. Do we try to intervene? How do we even intervene? I mean, I see people saying, why isn't Hezbollah doing it? I mean, the person asking the question, why aren't you? And if you thought about the answer to that question, it's because, number one, you can't. You don't have the means to get to Gaza. And if you did get there, you'd be vaporized in the first 5 minutes of fighting Israel. And Hezbollah understands, look at a map where they are on the map and where Gaza is. It's not that easy to just move troops and equipment around and to do that. So I have to think, is it going to help or is it going to escalate and make it worse? And they've all decided that's only going to make it worse.
Yeah, I mean, Hezbollah could fire all those missiles that it has, but then missiles would be fired right back at Hezbollah. So it is, regardless of how it happens, it's going to mean destruction. And is the resistance, so we look at the axis of resistance, prepared for that? It's unclear. And if we see, this is now a month in, how things have transpired, it's obvious that the axis of resistance, with varying levels of coordination, have determined that they are not capable of providing definitive support that will change the calculus of the situation. They will not be able to end the suffering through their intervention. So they are doing what they can, especially on the diplomatic realm, especially in relation to, trying to get some kind of settlement to pressure the international arena to do that. That's where they're operating, and it's that's where we're at. So
yes,
I think it's something we're gonna have to keep an eye out on. But perhaps we can now get to Ukraine, because Ukraine has kind of become a afterthought. But certainly a lot has been going on, and just a few points. So we know that Mr. Zelensky, General Valery Zelensky, has given another Economist interview. I don't know, remember last year, he gave an interview saying, give me a whole army, give me all these tanks and armored carriers, blah, blah, blah. Give me a laundry list of armaments and we'll go and we'll defeat Russia. Now he's saying that there is no breakthrough. Of course, the counteroffensive, we don't have to use that term anymore because it is over. It's gone. It's done. Now they're talking about stalemate. And I wanted to pull up Vladimir Zelensky. He was on Meet the Press, I believe it was, recently. And I think his reaction to the final question, our friend Alex Christoforou posted this on his Twitter account or X account. It's a really funny clip, but I think it gets to where things are at. And then, Brian, I want your comments on this and of course, where things are at on the battlefield. But let's listen to Zelensky respond to, what is quite, I believe, a pointed concluding question to an interview. Here we go.
Before you go, if you want to share, what keeps you going? Do you ever feel defeated?
I have a lot of power, but even feeling strong and have a lot of energy, it doesn't mean that we want to fight all our life, because the price is high, like I said, because the war takes the best of us, the best heroes, the best men, women, children. That's it. But we are not ready to give our freedom to this terrorist group. That's it. That's why we are fighting. That's it.
That's it.
That's
so a meltdown of sorts. There are many jokes we could make about that 50-second exchange, but your reaction to what this tells us about where the conflict is, and of course, where is the conflict?
So as you mentioned, the Ukrainian offensive, that is over. They announced an operational pause. That's just the closest they can politically get to admitting that it's over and that it has failed. Obviously, it failed. And you're absolutely right. General Zaluzhny last year was talking about this wish list of equipment, ammunition, weapons that they needed to have a successful offensive against Russia, to expel them from this territory that they were considering in the south and getting to Crimea even. But I think you remember we were talking about this even months before the offensive began, and we said that there's absolutely no way for it to succeed. You just look at the reality on the ground. There's absolutely no way for Ukraine to succeed. People kept citing the previous year's fall offensives in Kherson and Kharkov, and they said, well, look at how well they did then. But if you actually examine objectively what happened, they lost an entire army conducting those two offensives. It's a war of attrition, and they were exchanging their army and their ammunition for territory. And I said at the time that's actually bringing them one step closer to defeat, not toward victory. And then the idea of doing it again on a much larger scale in the south, that was going to be a disaster, because no matter where they ended, even if they reached Crimea, this new army that NATO transferred to them would be gone. And if you looked at what Russia was doing at the same time, they were building their forces up. They were bringing in more men. They were mobilizing more men, bringing them in. And they were expanding military-industrial production, which was already enormous at the beginning of the special military operation. And I've talked for months and months, and people are probably tired of hearing me say it. The West does not have the military-industrial capacity to sustain a war on this scale. The artillery ammunition, they admit they cannot make enough. They're talking about expanding production by, say, 2025 or maybe 2027. They're not sure, and they're running into a lot of problems doing this. But even when they reach that target, it's still less than what they admit Russia is producing right now. The New York Times admitted that they're making probably 2 million rounds a year, which is more than the U.S. and European Union combined after they expand production, if they can expand production. So when you look at these things on paper and you add it up, there's absolutely no way Ukraine could ever have won this. The Western media, Western governments are admitting they don't have the ability to continue arming Ukraine. We're listening to General Zelensky now talk about how Russian air power is stronger. They have all of these mines. They have this huge advantage in terms of manpower. And Mark Sloboda said basically what he was wishing for from the West is for Russia's army. In order to win this conflict, they need Russia's army to do it, because Russia's military has all of these things Ukraine would actually need in order to win. And then he started talking about technology that does not even exist. And that's how you know it's over for them. And when The Economist had this interview with General Zelensky, but he also wrote a 9-page paper about how to win positional war. And when you read it and you think that this is the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, you ask yourself, how did someone like this ever get into a position like that in the first place? He clearly doesn't understand what's going on. He has no idea. I mean, if you just take that paper for face value, he doesn't understand how it works, and he has no idea how to remedy the situation. But then you ask yourself, if he was competent, would he even want that job in the first place? So I'm pretty sure someone like General Zelensky, that's the best that they can get. A Banderite. You have a regime infested with Banderites, a pawn of U.S. foreign policy, and in this unsustainable, unwinnable conflict, who is going to be competent and volunteer to do that job? Nobody. So you get someone like General Zelensky, and this is the predictable outcome. Someone who didn't anticipate the use of landmines. I mean, just that alone. Not looking at the New York Times last December, their article with all of the pictures and satellite images and diagrams of Russian defenses stretching from the line of contact all the way back to Crimea, looking at that and thinking, do we have any possible way of breaching that? The answer is no. There's no way you're going to breach that. So why did you even try? That's where we are right now, basically.
Yeah. And where is the fighting happening now? I mean, and what is the future of the fighting? Because there have been conflicting reports. One side of these reports is that the United States is looking to Zelensky to come to some kind of agreement to negotiate peace. And then there's the other side. I think the State Department came out as soon as today, November 8th, saying, actually, no, we're not looking for Ukraine to pause anything. We're still all in. So it seems like the fighting is going to continue, but where is it happening now? And what is the future of it, given that, well, it seems like the writing is on the wall. There's no breakthrough. If Ukraine is saying stalemate, it appears the situation is probably a lot worse than that.
Absolutely. It is. It's much worse. It is not a stalemate. It's a war of attrition. Russia is not interested in seizing territory. Their goal is to just grind down Ukraine's military. That is what they've been doing all this year. That's what they did for most of last year. That was the whole point of the fighting in Bakhmut, in the northeast, in the Donbas region. They were just drawing in as many Ukrainian forces, as much equipment as possible, and destroying it. And people warned, after a certain point, even the Western media was warning that you're preparing for this major offensive, supposedly in the spring, and you're sending all of these men and all of this equipment. Some of their best equipment was being sent there. Wouldn't that be better if you kept that for the offensive? But they were so committed to trying to hold Bakhmut, even though it was completely irrational to try to do so, that they fed a significant part of their military into Bakhmut. So now where's the fighting? At Dhaiphong, right outside Donetsk city. This is a heavily fortified city. It's probably the most fortified city Ukraine has along the line of contact. This has been a flashpoint since 2014, basically. And Russia has been improving their positions around Avdiivka. A lot of people keep talking about a big arrow offensive by Russia. Russia could conduct a big arrow offensive, but just like happened to Ukraine, it'll be extremely costly. And I think Russia would rather continue this methodical approach that they have applied and try to spare as much men and equipment as possible. And so that seems to be what they're doing. They're improving their positions around Avdiivka. There's a coke plant. This is not Coca-Cola. It's involved in coal, different chemical byproducts of coal. They're trying to take this industrial complex. It's massive. There's a massive rail yard there. If they're able to take that, they have a commanding position over all of the roadways in and out and railways in and out of Avdiivka. They'll essentially be cutting Ukrainian forces off. And that's what it looks like they're doing. They're not going to storm this heavily fortified city. They're going to cut it off, and they'll methodically grind down everyone that's still stuck in there. They're keeping pressure all along the line of contact. The very, very meager gains that Ukraine did make during their offensive. And I mean, when they have an article about this and they show you the map and all the changed territory, you have to enlarge it. It's impossible to see with your eye where they gained territory because it was so negligible. But those negligible gains are being reversed, and Russia is improving their positions along the line of contact in the south. And they've been putting pressure on Kupiansk up in the north. And that was one of the cities that Ukraine captured during their fall offensive last year. And so even that success, that so-called success, is being reversed. And a fortified city like Avdiivka, if that goes, then I mean that is going to force them to fall back to positions that may not be as well fortified. And all while that's taking place, all of this fighting along the line of contact, Russia continues these deep strikes at military infrastructure, command and control, logistics. We don't know if they're going to start targeting the electric grid again, but they're wearing that down. Part of that infrastructure is air defense. They have been whittling down Ukrainian air defense all along. That is having an accumulative effect. That has allowed Russian air power to operate more freely along the line of contact. And eventually it's going to allow them to act more freely beyond the line of contact. So this is a problem that Ukraine has, that it's Western sponsors who put them in this position in the first place. There is absolutely no way for them to solve this. They keep talking about money. They keep talking about sending more arms, more air defense. It physically does not exist. It does not exist, and they cannot will it into existence now or in the intermediate future. It has to be derived from military industrial production, which requires factories and human resources that would take years and years to develop. They're not even talking about doing it. So once they talk about doing it, then it'll be years from that point onward. Yes, I see people in the comment section talking about the F-16s. Yes, so they have additional so-called wonder weapons to try to throw at this problem, but it's definitely not going to solve it. And when you read General Zelensky'S 9-page assessment, you can see that even he understands at this point that barring some sort of science fiction super weapon, there's absolutely nothing that they can do. They're just going to continue to be ground down until there's nothing left. Now, how does it end ultimately? It's hard to tell because we don't know exactly what Russia's final objective is. Do they want Odessa? Do they want Kharkov? Do they want Kiev? I don't know. They didn't tell me. But what they will almost certainly achieve is demilitarizing Ukraine. They've basically demilitarized at least certain aspects of NATO. And I think it's eventually going to create a situation where there might be a political change in Kiev. For me, from my perspective, the best case scenario would be for Russia to transform Ukraine into a nation state similar to Belarus, where it's friendly, doesn't have to be absorbed administratively by Russia, but it's friendly, and they create the conditions where U.S. interference and political capture is no longer possible.
Well, it appears, given the situation that you just outlined, and given the larger global situation where we have Gaza literally on fire, Israel, you see Zelensky complaining a lot about how the conflict in the Middle East, how the situation regarding Israel and Palestine is overtaking the Ukraine conflict. Given the situation on the battlefield, given that larger global context, it feels like the situation is fading into the background. However, I think it's important to note that the overall objectives that NATO, the United States at the lead, have with regard to Ukraine and with regard to the region are not necessarily going to go away. They may fade into the background, but they won't go away. Just like the Middle East fade into the background, and then suddenly, with Israel conducting this, horrendous assault, the United States is pivoting all kinds of ways to try to achieve objectives, including provoke Iran and engage in a regional war for its hegemony. And I think the same is kind of true here. So I'm wondering, Brian, what are your thoughts about where that will go then? Because what are these other fronts? What are the options for the United States and NATO, given that Ukraine is not going to be the breakthrough that they hoped it would be?
It's a very good point that you bring up, Danny. The mindset, the motives that drove this proxy war to begin with, that is still there. That is all still in place. The U.S. Political leadership, the corporate financier interests that drive their foreign policy, they still are bent on hegemony, global hegemony. They're still bent on upholding this unipolar world order that they created, that's persisted for decades. They want to reassert that. And so what are they going to do? Are they just going to accept that they've lost this proxy war in Ukraine? They'll make it as painful as possible for Russia. So I don't think that there's going to be a quick and easy end to the fighting. And we have to always keep our mind open to the possibility, however irrational it may seem. Just remember how irrational this proxy war was to begin with. I've warned constantly about the potential of the U.S., its allies, or some sort of proxy creating some sort of buffer zone within Ukrainian territory. So we have to be aware of that and keep an eye on that. While the U.S. was in the middle of focusing on its Ukraine proxy war, we remember that they were trying to light all of these fires all along Russia's periphery. And they're still trying to do that. Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Kosovo, Serbia. And so we just have to keep an eye on all of that, because they're not done. And then regarding the Middle East and also here in Asia, they're going to continue pushing along these fronts, and they're getting desperate, and they're resorting to increasingly dangerous options to try to reverse the situation that they're in. So how does it end in Ukraine? It's going to be a long, painful process. Russia is going to continue this process that they have begun, that they were implementing in Syria from 2015 onward. Very patient, thinking strategically, avoiding provocations at all costs. Their ultimate revenge against the West and everything that it has done to Russia and its allies, that revenge will be ultimate victory. They're not interested in short-term, immediate retaliation. But we have to be aware that the U.S. and its allies are going to try to provoke Russia into some sort of miscalculation. And that's what we have to be on the lookout for now as things begin to irreversibly shift in Ukraine.
And then maybe lastly on Ukraine, the political future, because Zelensky has rejected elections. It seems like the United States is interested in elections. Feels like that's a natural pivot for the United States if it can wash its hands with the worst excesses of this conflict, including the corruption of the Ukrainian government that it literally created. It can do so with kind of these faux elections. You get rid of Zelensky and perhaps people around Zelensky, and you can go on with some slow rolling conflict from there on out while you regroup and try to figure out what's the next flashpoint, as you were mentioning. So what is the political future for Ukraine? We've seen Zelensky literally begging on, maybe I can even pull that up because it's actually
if you can't give us money, just give us credit. I mean,
yes,
it is.
I need to show it. It's actually really funny. It's only 10 seconds. Here we go.
If you can't give us some financial support, okay, please give us a credit, and we will give you back money.
So I mean, these are new lows, I think, for
It is.
Zelensky. But I think it shows the new low in the conflict. Then, I mean, then what is the future for Ukraine then? Because the stability, the veneer of stability seems to have been stripped off altogether.
Yeah, it's absolute desperation, and you see it from the president of Ukraine. You see it from the commander-in-chief, General Zelensky, basically penning what it amounts to delusion. It's just delusion in written form. And when you see President Zelensky begging for money publicly like this, these are not things that you say publicly. These are things you talk about behind closed doors. When you say things publicly like this, the entire world can see how weak and desperate you are. It's only going to compound your problems. With the political future of Ukraine, the economic and military future of Ukraine is just desolation. It's just going to continue to spiral downward. I can't imagine anything the West could do to reverse this, because the West doesn't care. The United States, Washington, Brussels, London, they don't care about Ukraine. They never did. It was always just a proxy that they were going to use and then discard. That's how they've used all of their other proxies. That is exactly how they were going to use Ukraine. And now we're at the end of this process. They've used Ukraine. There's very little use they can get out of it. What are they going to do to reverse this? Unless they think by reversing it somehow they can still achieve their foreign policy objectives versus Russia, then maybe they might attempt something. But what can they do? Because they themselves have economic problems, socio-political problems that they cannot solve. How are they going to solve these much more acute problems in Ukraine? So the future is, there's no good outlook for Ukraine. Probably the only people that actually genuinely care about what happens in Ukraine is Russia, ironically. And it will be probably Russia that ends up salvaging whatever is left of Ukraine, unless, of course, the West creates some sort of buffer zone. And then what would happen with that buffer zone? I mean, just think about no future. I mean, the Ukrainian people right now have no future. And I make this point all the time when I talk about U.S. interference around the globe. They convince these opposition groups, these client regimes full of these people who never be able to achieve power on their own. They're thrust into power, and they become completely dependent on the U.S. because of that fact that they couldn't achieve power on their own. You know, that they're leading the country over a cliff. They imagine, and we remember all of the optimism that we heard out of the Ukrainian the client regime from 2014 onward. All of this optimism, Ukraine was going to be this, it was going to be that, it was going to be a hub for this and that, and a bridge and everything else. And it just ended up being a wasteland. And maybe, because we probably should talk about Asia, Taiwan, the administration in Taiwan is doing the exact same thing. They're talking about all of these opportunities that the West has to offer, even as they watch Ukraine be decimated. And it's not the first time this has happened. And so what are they thinking? Why do they think that they're the exception? And the Ukrainian administration, they thought that they were the exception. And now look at where they are. So again, there's no future for Ukraine as long as it is a U.S. proxy. If ever Russia is able to lead it out of that status, then maybe we can talk. But it will still be years and years of reconstruction.
Mm. Yeah, we know when the United States is able to assert its influence in colonies, former colonies, client states, the economies generally don't do well. The Ukrainian economy right now is in tatters. It's an absolute disaster. And the political future of Ukraine is certainly in bad hands should that outcome that you described, a buffer zone, the attempt to maybe keep Kiev afloat as the conflict essentially ends in Russia's favor in every other single area, it won't be good. And so I think that is a astute prediction, if we can make any prediction, it's that if the United States persists and continues on this path with regard to Ukraine, we mentioned how the United States doesn't care about Palestinians. It will allow Israel to do whatever it wants to the Palestinian people as long as it meets U.S. interests. The United States certainly doesn't care about Ukraine. It was more than willing to sacrifice over about 500,000 Ukrainian so-called armed forces, all in the name of a dirty war against Russia. So it's quite likely that Ukraine's future was bleak if the United States and NATO, of course, are going to continue to be allowed to get its way in that country. So, Brian, let's move to our final topic in China and Asia. I know you've been writing a lot about this. I wanted to talk first. Maybe we can just begin with there's been a recent, of course, we've talked a lot about this, diplomacy. The United States has been engaging in, again, what I would call faux diplomacy. You had Gavin Newsom in Beijing, and he traveled all across China. Very interesting choice for the United States to bring a governor of California out there. Had a lot of sweet words, a lot of nice words. China was very diplomatic and enthusiastic about that visit. You also had Wang Yi in Washington. He met with Joe Biden. He met with Blinken. And, you know, I'm wondering first your initial comments on this, because there are rumblings within China's political leadership that they're kind of gearing up for what comes next, which is likely an escalation, given that there have been no commitments and election season is coming. So what has been your assessment? And maybe you can talk about some of these little discussed, maybe they'll get a Reuters report here and there, little discussed points of engagement for the United States in the region, which point to the fact that the United States is still very much committed to a conflict with China.
One thing that I've noticed is that right before the U.S. is ready to escalate or drive the dagger in deepest, they usually engage in very, very open and eager diplomacy with whoever is the targeted nation. We remember then U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry having dinner with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, all while they were sitting there eating. The U.S. had been planning for years to overthrow his government through a protest and violence, militant proxy war. That's what they were preparing while he was sitting down eating with them. We remember President Barack Obama meeting with Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of Libya. Again, for years and years, they were planning and had been attempting to overthrow his government. And so when the West begins doing this, it's usually to put people off guard. It's also very useful to portray the U.S. as pursuing diplomacy outwardly, while inwardly they're undermining that very diplomacy. They are attempting to provoke many of these targeted nations. When these nations react to those provocations, those more covert provocations, the U.S. says, "See, we tried diplomacy. Look at them; they're committed to aggression." And this is a point that they have articulated this in their policy papers. I always talk about the 2009 Which Path to Persia paper by the Brookings Institution. And they have entire paragraphs about, entire chapters about how, we want to provoke Iran into a war. We have to make it look like they are at fault. It's very hard to do this without people noticing it. We could use different types of covert pressure to achieve this. And if that's what they're talking about regarding Iran, I guarantee you they also have policy very similar to that regarding Russia. And now we're talking about China almost certainly. We have to remember that China is the central obsession of U.S. foreign policy. It has been for decades. They want to encircle and contain China. Almost everything they do is toward that goal. They're talking about diplomacy with China, inviting the Chinese president to San Francisco for this APEC meeting. But as they're doing that, they're waging a proxy war in Myanmar to cut off one route of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. They're arming Taiwan recognized by the U.S. State Department as part of China. So they're promoting separatism as they're inviting the Chinese president to San Francisco. The Philippines. I just wrote an article for New Eastern Outlook about the Philippines, and when the Marcos Jr. first became president, I thought maybe he would play a balancing act. He would allow some sort of basing agreement with the U.S., but he would continue the Belt and Road Initiative with China. They would go ahead with these infrastructure projects. But recently, they announced that they're going to cancel the Chinese funding for the railway projects, 3 of them. And then they said that they'll look for an alternative contractor to build them. Well, who else in the region builds railways? Not the U.S., not Australia, not even Japan. They don't build. But that's what the Philippine government said, that we will look to the West to build this railway, which means they're not going to build any infrastructure. If it means working with China, we'd just rather have no infrastructure at all. So the only thing being built in the Philippines right now are military bases to antagonize the Philippines' largest and most important trade partner, which happens to be China. Its largest export market is China, and its most important import partner is China. So that is what's going on. The Philippines is maneuvering themselves to be the Southeast Asian version of Ukraine, and they're already suffering by playing this role. They will suffer more as tensions escalate. As that is taking place, as these decisions are being made, as the U.S. is planning further military expansion in the Philippines, and also Japan and South Korea, they're inviting the Chinese president to San Francisco to this APEC meeting, pretending that they seek some sort of diplomatic resolution to all of this, when in fact they are still completely, wholly committed to encircling and containing China. They're still waging the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. They're still backing Israel in the Middle East, trying to overturn that entire region. All of that feeds into their plan to encircle and contain China. If you look at a map of their 3 main proxy wars that are going or in the making, Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, Philippines, look at a map. It is encircling the heart of Eurasia, Russia, China, Iran. So people have to keep that in mind. And when I see the U.S. being overly diplomatic with China, I just wonder what do they have planned? What are they going to try to provoke?
Yeah, and there was an article, I don't know if you saw it, Brian, in The Economist. I thought it was quite an important article. Mentions China literally 11 times. It's a very short article. American power indispensable or ineffective. And in it, it lays out the 3 threats to the United States, essentially. It's hegemony. And the third one, it says, is the biggest. China has ambitions to create an alternative to the values enshrined in global institutions. It would reinterpret concepts like democracy, freedom, and human rights to suit its own preferences for development over individual freedom and national sovereignty over universal values. God, whatever that means. China, Russia, and Iran are forming a loosely coordinated group. Iran supplies drones to Russia and oil to China. Russia and China have given Iran's client Hamas, which I believe is a misnomer, diplomatic cover at the United Nations. So that you literally just said, they're encircling Russia, China, and Iran. And here's The Economist admitting that China is the biggest threat out of the 3, and that the 3 are coordinating, cooperating, and that's the biggest threat to the United States' supremacy.
Yeah, and they're admitting that it's about U.S. supremacy around the globe. That's what's actually at risk. It's not that they believe China is some sort of national security threat to the United States itself. It is not. They attempt to portray China as some sort of threat to America's so-called allies in the region, Asia Pacific. China is not. All of these countries here in this region, including Thailand, where I'm based, China is their largest, most important trade partner, their largest source of tourism, one of the largest, if not the largest source of investment, and infrastructure partner. China is building infrastructure here that no one else would ever have built for this region. The region itself is not quite there yet in order to build it themselves. So everyone here is benefiting. What threat does China pose to this region? But from America's point of view, this is a whole region slipping out from under U.S. primacy. And if you read U.S. policy papers over the years, they talk about U.S. primacy over Asia. The United States is not located in Asia. Why should it hold primacy over Asia? It doesn't even, at face value, it doesn't even make sense unless you're going to admit that America is a global empire and it wants to maintain that global empire. Well, how do you justify doing that? And how do you talk about democracy, human rights, self-determination, when ultimately you're talking about subordinating the entire planet to Washington and the interests driving the foreign policy implemented there? So yes, it's becoming more and more overt. I've seen a lot of articles like that, as a matter of fact, where they're just coming out and admitting that China is going to be able to do what it wants, and the U.S. isn't going to be able to do anything about it. But isn't that how sovereignty works? You're allowed to do what you want, and no one can intervene and tell you otherwise, unless it's about something you're doing beyond your borders that is malicious and contrary to international law. But the U.S. cannot cite anything that China is doing that actually constitutes that sort of threat. So they invent, they fabricate, they exaggerate certain things that China is doing, and that is at the core of their foreign policy. So, and again, keep in mind, they're writing articles like this. These conversations are happening in Washington, and they want to pretend that they're extending an olive branch to China and inviting the Chinese president to San Francisco.
To the United States, I mean, to the United States' credit, perhaps, unlike in past instances, Janet Yellen going to China when there's a literal travel warning for all U.S. citizens that the State Department puts out about how dangerous China is. Blinken going to China, and then Joe Biden immediately calling Xi Jinping a dictator once he returns. There was also the instance of Gina Raimondo going to China, singing praises about how they're going to be able to, to build up commercial ties in areas where there are no sanctions, of course. But then comes back and says, "Oh wow, oh that phone that was released by Huawei, that's a big deal. Oops, I think we're gonna have to get tough on China about chip technology." Unlike in past instances where it's literally been the U.S. supposedly engages in the diplomacy and then comes back and reverses whatever so-called diplomacy was done. This time around, there wasn't anything of the sort because, of course, the United States is completely mired in the Israel-Gaza situation. But the media slipped in a little bit of a reminder, I think, to people. And here's the BBC. The U.S. is quietly arming Taiwan to the teeth. So what's interesting about this article, Brian, is that the BBC is reporting on something that's actually not breaking news. So I think we've talked about this. The United States has approved, of course, more funding, more arming of Taiwan. They're talking about a small sum, $80 million, in relation to a $14 billion war chest for Taiwan up until this point. But the big issue here is that it's done under the Foreign Military Finance Program, which is what the United States uses for Ukraine in order to bypass any kind of congressional restrictions and any pauses in the the movement of arms. So with that said, Brian, I mean, this is like almost just a little reminder. It was like breaking news, but actually not so breaking. It's just to remind us that the United States is still very much engaged in a proxy war against China on this issue specifically, but you already mentioned a couple more.
Yeah, the United States refuses to recognize the reality that China is surpassing not just the U.S., but the collective West, the G7. And China is going to surpass the United States and then the G7, and the organizations that China is a part of, this movement toward multipolarism, by far eclipses the collective West, its power and its influence. And they cannot accept it because they have a supremacist mentality. These are people who for generations acted on the global stage with the idea that they are superior to all others. It's part racism. You know, we talk about convincing the public to go along with these different types of agendas. For China, it's a downhill battle because you know in the United States there's still a lot of inherent racism. China is a non-white nation that is going to surpass the United States. It's not hard to convince American people that this is bad and it needs to be prevented at all costs. You know, when people stop and think about it, wait, China has 5 times our population. They have a bigger industrial base. They have access to all kinds of resources. Their education system is larger and better. Why shouldn't it surpass us? It's like, you know, the United States has a larger GDP than Portugal. There's nothing radical or extreme about that. It's just the reality of having a geographically larger country, a larger population, a larger industrial base. Should Portugal be doing everything in its power to reverse this? It makes no sense. U.S. foreign policy regarding China and its attempt to contain China's rise is utterly irrational. It's immoral, it's indefensible, but also it's impractical because China is not going to be, the U.S. is not going to stop China. If they try to, it's going to trigger an extremely destructive conflict. China is a nuclear arms nation too, by the way, and they're most likely looking at expanding their nuclear arsenal specifically because they know full well the U.S. will not accept this and that it might come down to needing to deter the U.S. in the only language that they understand, which is force, or at least the threat of force. So that is where we are. China is going to go along with this. I would imagine that they're going to go along, at least to a certain degree, this invitation to APEC. They want to try to explore all diplomatic possibilities. They don't want to burn bridges. Most of all, they don't want to burn bridges. They don't want to alienate the American people because they understand that the problem is specifically in Washington, on Wall Street, in London, in Brussels. It's not the collective population of the West. And they can see a future where they could eventually work together with the collective West. But they understand the people right now making these decisions. These people cannot be trusted. They could not be relied on. And ultimately, I think they're fully aware that their actual agenda is still to encircle, control, divide, and destroy China. That is the dream scenario still in the minds of many in Washington.
Right. And, you know, China remembers full well the 2020 election between Biden and Trump. It was a competition between who could be toughest on China. I don't think China is naive to the fact that when 2024 comes around and you have a Biden administration that has literally lost in Ukraine and will have to somehow ignore the fact that it has allowed Israel to, who knows how many Palestinians will have been killed by that time. It will be no surprise to China that China suddenly comes back onto the political stage as the foremost targeted country in terms of propaganda war, political rumblings and hand-wringing, and also, real policy. Because, as you said, Brian, this is something that's happening regardless of wherever else the United States may be entangled. It is something that is being done in conjunction. And what's so interesting about this moment is that, for example, with the Israel-Palestine conflict, China is kind of in the lead on that in terms of the alternative. China is one of the few countries outside of the Arab and Muslim majority countries in the region, but really, in some ways, it does more than that because of its position. It stands for the UN resolutions that call for a Palestinian state, and was able to stand up to Israel when it got attacked by the Israeli envoy because they rejected a ceasefire, a proposal that was nothing of the sort. It was simply a rubber stamp on what Israel is doing, with perhaps a minor pause. So China also serves as this diplomatic alternative. You mentioned earlier too, with what China did with Iran and Saudi Arabia, and we can go on and on and on with the Belt and Road Initiative. And, if China maintains a positive relationship with the United States and is able to do all of these diplomatic, economic, and political, policies regarding cooperation, I don't know if there's any bigger threat to the United States in its own mind, at least in the minds of those who who conduct foreign policy, the foreign policy establishment. There's no bigger threat to the foreign policy establishment than a country that can both engage in positive relations with a so-called adversary and at the same time maintain an independent political and, of course, economic posture.
Absolutely. And people have to understand that if you have a supremacist mentality, you believe you are superior to these other groups of people. You are superior to the Chinese. The Chinese had been subordinated to the West. The British and the Americans had been on the road toward colonizing China and humiliated China over the course of an entire century. And then you see them building themselves up, reaching parity, and then preparing to surpass you. I mean, think about it from a couple of different perspectives. Just the fear of comeuppance, the West paying for what it has done to China for generations now. Just that alone probably keeps them up at night. But then also, what if you have built everything predicated on supremacy, controlling the planet, monopolizing industry and markets, and now all of that is disappearing. It's being displaced by this alternative that China is helping create. What future do you have? You have no future. You will never accept a place among other nations because you believe you should be imposing yourself upon all other nations. And so it is a mentality, and it's deeply rooted. I don't think people understand it is institutionally rooted in the United States. The education side, I mean, I'm an American. I was born and raised in the United States. I went through the U.S. education system. I watched American television, programming, U.S. media. This is the mindset that every American, this is what at least tries to take root. Thankfully, for a lot of Americans, it doesn't. But we're taught that we are the best, and we cannot accept this. And it's an existential threat, even though it isn't. It's an existential threat that we're not number one, even though it's not actually any sort of existential threat. So, it's so dangerous. And we don't know how far the current circles of power in the U.S., how far they're going to go with all of this. Look at what they've done to Ukraine. Look at how dangerously close to direct conflict with Russia they've brought us. Look at what they're doing in the Middle East right now. What would they do to prevent this non-white nation from surpassing the U.S.? What would they do? And I honestly don't know the answer to that question. China seems very serious about covering all of its bases and creating a significant enough deterrence and a significant enough ability to weather whatever the United States decides to do, it and its allies decide to do.
Yeah, and it brought me back to Palestine. When I was in Vietnam, I thought to myself, wow, what if, Palestine is like this very particular situation which we thought was a thing of the past, right? Colonialism and an entire nation not having virtually any, not even nominal sovereignty, not even any recognition, in being oppressed in this way. Then you're in a place like Vietnam, and you're like, wow, look what people can do when they have liberated themselves from that. And China is almost at another level, because while Vietnam has a lot of achievements, it's still relatively poor, and it has a long way to go, because it's only had, I think, 3 decades. Less than 3 decades since it was out of sanctions. And if anybody knows the history of Vietnam and how much it was bombed, you'd understand why development is still very much a work in progress. But China's at this other level entirely. It is this example of a country that, with regard to that Economist article, they said a threat was national sovereignty being prioritized over universal values. And that to me is a euphemism for universal values, a euphemism for rules-based international order, or whatever the United States wants.
Which is a euphemism for American imperialism.
Exactly. Whatever the United States wants, U.S. imperialism, its dominance, its rules, its values. And so I think what's important to remember here, whether we're looking at the Taiwan situation, whether we're looking at any flashpoint with regard to the United States and its conflict with China, that China is kind of the standard bearer of what the United States never wants to happen. They call it, in that Economist article, they also call China almost like another Soviet Union, because they see China as this competing power that came from a place where they'd much rather China be, which is a place of destitution, of complete and utter oppression, no sovereignty, super exploited. They want that China back, but instead, this world that you talk about, Brian, like it's not a bad thing that the United States is no longer the, dominant power in the world. The problem is that when that happens, the world is actually a better place, because what the United States has done with its hegemony has actually been disastrous for much of the world, has actually led the world into a much darker place. And that is set to possibly end, and the world could be better with China and, of course, these other countries doing things differently, prioritizing sovereignty, prioritizing development, prioritizing prosperity for everybody, prioritizing lifting the poorest of us out first, versus allowing the wealthiest and the richest to essentially run away with everything.
Absolutely. And I have been here in Asia almost my entire adult life, and in particular here in Thailand. And I've watched the transformation. And you have to think about it. It's not just Thailand as this contained country here in Southeast Asia. You have to think about the entire region and who was primarily influencing the region, say, 20 years ago, and who's primarily influencing it right now. And how has the change been? Has it been from negative to positive? And I would say absolutely. It's gone from a negative to a very positive situation. You can see development taking place only because of China's rise. And if it wasn't for China's rise, the US would still be in this region trying to divide nations against each other, trying to divide nations internally. I think that has been the main problem for Southeast Asia. A lot of the countries here, Thailand excluded, who's the only country in Southeast Asia not colonized by Western powers, but all of Thailand's neighbors were colonized by European powers, the British Empire, the French Empire, and they deliberately created all of these political, religious, ethnic divisions to divide and conquer. And when these countries gained their independence, the French, the British, and then the United States, they didn't just say, oh, good luck with your independence. No, they continued investing in these divisions. They did not want these nations, just like you say, Danny, China is their biggest fear. A nation that they had once subjugated rising up above them. They do not want to see that. But think about the type of human being you have to be for that to be your values and your desires, your ambitions in the world, is to keep everyone else down. It's so funny. You see people worried about what China's doing. China's demonstrably creating an international system where national sovereignty holds primacy. There is no arbiter declaring, including not even China, that's going to declare what can and cannot happen inside somebody's sovereign borders. They're very clear about that. And they're creating a very careful balance of power internationally that will prevent them from doing that, even if in the future some sort of administration comes into power in China that is tempted to do that. They're not going to be able to, because of the nature of this multipolar system that is being created. It's compare and contrast it with the United States. It is not just China rising as the next America or the next British Empire. It is unique, and I think people need to recognize that. And we have to understand at the root of this, it's not about politics or ideology. It's about Russia, China, many other nations working very hard to create tangible alternatives, alternative infrastructure, financial institutions, factories that are producing goods that only the West used to make and to dominate certain markets. They are creating all of these alternatives. And by creating these alternatives, now you have many on the playing field. It creates a better balance of power. It's not designed to be perfect and solve all problems. It's designed to balance power and check the worst impulses of any individual nation or group of nations.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, we can wrap up the topics there, Brian. I've kept you a while now. I'll just say quickly that when I was in Vietnam, I was trying to be the steward of like, oh, well, you know, and maybe we can talk more about this if you wanted to have me on your show about my trip to Vietnam. I was trying to act as this, like, I was with American veterans, part of the Veterans for Peace organization, because they have a chapter out there, 160. And I was trying to be this, like, you know, Vietnam, China, they're part of this similar process. We should be, you know, looking at any work that's being done with Vietnam in a similar vein. And we look at this geopolitical situation with China because it's important to combat the divisions that are trying to be sown between the two. And it was hard because I've been to China twice, and I would tell people that on the trip, and they'd be like, oh, really? Oh my gosh, like, isn't everyone spying on you in China? And I'm just like, you know, you're in Vietnam, and they were saying the same things about Vietnam not too long ago when relations weren't normal. It used to be completely and utterly dangerous to travel to Vietnam because of that boogeyman Communist Party that's in leadership. Like, that only changed recently because of geopolitics. That's the only reason why the Vietnam is being talked about differently now. So it was just very interesting to talk to people and get that reaction, because it just shows that this campaign to denigrate China and demonize China is about creating an environment and an atmosphere for this conflict, for this attempt to wrestle hold of hegemony. And the only way you can do that is by cementing these outright lies about China. So with that said, Brian, you know, there were quite a few super chats. I'm just going to run down a few questions.
Ooh,
if you want to
we can do that. I'm not any
30 seconds, maybe quickly, because I should wrap up myself. But let's do a few questions. Thank you everyone that gave super chats, by the way. If you do want to support this show, the best way is on Patreon or Substack or YouTube. All of those links are in the video description. But here's Casey. Casey Anthony got away with it. Interesting. How much longer will the U.S. and Israel be allowed to blatantly violate international law in Syria before they have to deal with serious blowback, be it from Russia, Iran, or someone else? You can take that however quickly you want, Brian.
Again, they're doing this because they're trying to provoke a reaction from Syria or get Russia to miscalculate. And what we've seen Russia, Syria, Iran do is just exhibit patience. They understand that regionally and globally things are moving in their favor. Time is on their side, and they have to weather this, no matter how provocative it is, and no matter how cold and heartless it seems, to allow Israel, the United States, or any other nation to blatantly violate a nation's sovereignty, to murder people without reason, no matter how provocative that is. The alternative is to wade into a war that's going to reverse all of the gains that Syrians, Iranians, and Russians have all fought very hard to achieve. They're going to win. They do not want to be distracted from that course of action. And the same goes for all of these other conflicts we see the U.S. A rule of thumb is just look at who's trying to unite people and end conflict, and look at who is trying to provoke and drive conflict. And that will tell you who is working toward the benefit of the planet and its future, and who is trying to divide and conquer it.
Then we have a question from 72 Marshflower 15. Ever notice how similar Israeli propaganda is to Ukraine propaganda?
It's a very good point. And again, it's because it is the exact same process. Just imagine if the conflict in Ukraine, look at how insane things were in 2022. Imagine if this conflict dragged on for 70 years, how absolutely out of people's minds they would be about Ukraine, supporting Ukraine and sending it weapons. And we've even heard them talk about how we have to make Ukraine the next Israel. We've heard them even come out and say that. And just imagine if they succeeded in doing that, how irrational and how people would bend over backwards for Ukraine. In many ways, they already are. And it's because it's part of the same process.
All right. Well, I think we can leave it there. There were a lot more super chats, but they were mainly comments. Thank you all for your comments. I really appreciate all the support. Of course, support Brian over at the New Atlas. You can find all of his links in his YouTube channel. You can find him on Telegram. You can find all that information on the New Atlas. It's tagged here. Go to my video description to support this channel, Patreon, Substack. You can become a YouTube member. Of course, there are one-time options, buy me a coffee, all of that. Thanks all for your support. Brian, any last words before we head out today?
No, just thank you for having me on. I always enjoy these conversations. I hope people in the audience learn something or gain something positive. We just have to continue doing this. We have to, it's a long, difficult process. It's not going to be solved overnight. We have to keep chipping away at it little by little each day.
Indeed, indeed. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in. I'll actually be back on Friday morning, I believe, with Pepe Escobar to talk about his latest work on Russia and Gaza, and he was at the BRI forum. So tune into that 10:30 a.m. Eastern. I'll send all the information soon. Take good care. Have a good night, and see you then. Bye-bye.